Here is a fact about me that nobody at Magnolia Steakhouse in Charleston, South Carolina, knew on the night of June 14th. I had rehearsed 3 different ways to react if Jason Locke stood me up, and none of them involved crying into a birthday cake shaped like a golf ball, because apparently the bakery had run out of 18 candles and substituted a pudding green theme without asking. The private room smelled like seared butter and the particular hush of a restaurant that charges you for silence. Candlelight pooled on white tablecloth. Outside the tall windows, Charleston traffic moved in slow orange smears, and somewhere past that, the harbor exhaled the smell of salt and diesel that had followed me my whole life, without my ever once thinking it would matter later. It mattered later. Almost everything that night would turn out to matter later, which is, I've come to believe, the entire design of an 18th birthday. The last ordinary evening before your life quietly reorganizes itself around a decision you didn't know you'd already made. I stared at the little plastic golfer perched on white frosting. My father, Daniel Hayes, 51, ex-Navy, permanently unimpressed by anything that wasn't structurally sound, glanced at the cake, then at me, then at the empty chair across the table. "That candle's judging you," he said. "It's judging both of us." Jason Locke, 19, beta, my boyfriend of 11 months. The kind of pretty that made him late to everything because mirrors kept stopping him, was 31 minutes overdue for my 18th birthday dinner. I called. He answered on the 4th ring with a wall of bass drop and shouting behind him. "Elliot, don't start," he said, already exhausted by a conversation we hadn't had yet. "You said 7, I was on my way." Then Derek called. Of course. Derek Marsh, 19 Alpha, starting forward for the state championship lacrosse team. Jason's childhood best friend, the human embodiment of a trophy case, had a habit of calling exactly when Jason and I had plans, the way smoke alarms go off exactly when you're trying to nap. "He got the call," Jason said, breathless with second-hand excitement. "The Baltimore Scouts are flying in tomorrow. This is his whole future, Elliot. It's my birthday." "It's one dinner." A cheer went up behind him. Someone, Derek, unmistakably that golden retriever bark of a laugh, yelled something I didn't catch, and Jason laughed with him, not at me, not defending me. Just folded neatly into that other room like he'd never left it. My father set down his fork very quietly. Military men have a specific kind of quiet that means they're doing math on how many federal laws they could break and still make it home for dinner. "Put me on speaker," I said. A pause. "Why, put me on?" The bass dropped. Derek's voice arrived clear as a bell. "Is that Elliot? Tell him I'll buy him a cupcake tomorrow. Little man can share." Little man. I was 5'11". Derek was 6'2", and had never in his life needed to make anyone feel small, which was, I decided, exactly why he did it so casually. Some people bully out of instinct, the way other people breathe. I did not raise my voice. I have found, in 18 years of being underestimated by people who peaked in high school, that volume is for people who don't have better options. "Jason, stay with him." What does that mean? It means what it sounds like. You're being dramatic. "No drama," I said, and reached for the black folder sitting on the chair beside me, the one I'd been quietly not mentioning for 3 weeks. "Enjoy the party." I hung up before Jason could finish the sentence, "Where are you going?" which felt, honestly, like the first genuinely funny thing that had happened to me all night, because the answer was going to be excellent, and he was going to hear about it secondhand, which is exactly the kind of poetic justice I hadn't known I was capable of planning. My father looked at the folder. "You said maybe 3 weeks ago. I'm saying yes now." He studied my face the way he used to study cracked hulls before a deployment. For the hairline fracture that meant don't trust this thing at depth. He didn't find one. He closed the folder himself. "Passport." "In my jacket. Packed. Since Tuesday." He didn't smile, exactly, but something around his eyes loosened, the particular pride of a father watching his kid finally stop setting himself on fire to keep someone else warm. "Then move," he said, and threw a 20 on the table for a cake nobody would eat. 22 minutes later, I was in the passenger seat of his truck with one suitcase in the bed, learning that my phone could, in fact, buzz continuously for 4 straight minutes without overheating. "Jason, Jason, Jason." Then a text from an unknown number that I somehow already knew was Derek. "Don't punish your guy because you're insecure, little man." I blocked them both with the calm satisfaction of a man closing a tab he'd left open for 11 months. "You want to talk about it?" Dad asked at a red light. "No." "Want advice?" "No." He nodded once, the most respectful response available to either of us, and drove. At 8:14, a picture came through from an old backup number I hadn't blocked yet. Derek in the center of a sports bar in a Letterman jacket, arms slung over Jason's shoulders like a seatbelt, both of them laughing at something off camera. Jason's caption underneath, "See, everyone's here. Stop making this weird." I saved the photo. Evidence has a way of aging into comedy. And blocked that number too. "You two done?" Dad asked. "Very." He gave a short nod, the kind normally reserved for successful engine repairs, and got us to Charleston International in 40 minutes flat. Enjoying this one so far? If you want the rest of the story, the airport, the $1 trillion signature, and the guy in seat 14A, hit follow so it doesn't get lost in the feed. There's a lot more where this came from. A man in a slate gray suit waited near international departures, tall enough to look like furniture, with the specific stiffness of someone who found airports morally offensive. He held out a hand before I'd even fully stopped walking. Elliot Hayes. Charles Bennett. 60, Beta, Chief Trustee of the Ashworth Global Trust, a man who I would come to learn had never once raised his voice because he had learned early that money does the yelling for you. Charles Bennett. You understand that boarding this flight does not deposit anything into your checking account tonight. I read the agreement. Twice. Most 18-year-olds don't. Most 18-year-olds don't have a trustee waiting at security, holding a folder like it might bite him. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, more like a smile that had submitted its resignation and was working out notice. He opened the folder. By signing tonight, you enter the Ashworth Principal Beneficiary Program. Education, governance training, voting milestones, and a distribution schedule begin immediately. Understood, you'll have an allowance, not unlimited spending. Fine, you'll work. Good. You'll be evaluated constantly. By people who will not care that you're 18 and recently. He glanced, delicately, at my very red eyes, inconvenienced. Even better. Dad watched from behind the security rope, arms crossed, saying nothing, which from him was the loudest possible endorsement. Bennett noticed the silence and looked back at me. You can still walk away. I took the pen. No. I signed the acceptance line, then the acknowledgement line, then the witness line. My new signature still slightly unfamiliar under my own hand, like trying on a coat that fit better than expected. Bennett checked each page with the reverence of a man handling a bomb that had, against expectation, turned out to be a very large check. "Welcome to Ashworth," he said. My phone buzzed in my blocked caller void. Someone's voicemail, unheard, unmourned. I didn't check it. Somewhere behind me, a boy who thought volume equaled importance was still yelling into a sports bar, unaware that the person he'd been yelling at had just quietly become worth more than his entire future roster combined. That, I decided, walking toward the gate, was the funniest thing about being underestimated. Nobody ever asks what you're building while they're busy laughing at what you lost. Dad caught up to me at the checkpoint. "You don't owe anyone an apology for changing your mind." "I know. You don't owe your mother's family anything either." My mother had died when I was 6. The Ashworth line ran through her, a fact my father had never once used as leverage or excuse. He put one hand on my shoulder. "Build something you'd still want even if the money didn't exist." I nodded, throat tight in a way I refused to examine at an airport. "See you after training?" he said. "If Bennett doesn't scare you off first." "I heard that," Bennett said, from a genuinely impressive 11 feet away. Dad grinned. An actual grin, rare as snow in Charleston, and left me at the gate with a boarding pass to Singapore and a stomach full of something that felt, against all logic, almost like relief. I want to be clear that I did not expect to fall in love on a 14-hour flight to Singapore. I expected turbulence, bad in-flight pasta, and possibly a small, private cry somewhere over the Pacific that I could blame on cabin pressure. Instead, I got Sawyer Kane. Sawyer Kane, 20, Alpha, heir apparent to Callahan Kane Maritime, a Boston shipping dynasty old enough to have its own wing in a museum, was already sitting in 14A when I found my seat, one long leg crossed over the other, a maritime insurance brief open on his lap that he was very clearly not reading, since his eyes were closed and his head was tipped back against the seat rest with the boneless contentment of a man who had discovered, early in life, that most meetings could be survived through selective unconsciousness. He cracked one eye open, took in my swollen eyes and the black folder still clutched under my arm like a life raft, and said without preamble, "Rough birthday, excuse me? You've got someone ruined my cake energy." He nodded at the seat, not bothering to sit up further than absolutely necessary. "That's mine, by the way. You're 14B. I sat mortified, and he had the audacity to look pleased about it. The particular smugness of someone who enjoyed being right slightly more than the situation warranted, and slightly more than the effort of actually proving it. It's not my birthday cake, I said. It's a golf-themed identity crisis with frosting. Worse, continue. I don't owe you my tragic backstory. No, he agreed cheerfully, eyes drifting shut again. But we have 13 hours and 40 minutes together, and I've already decided not to read this brief, so you kind of do. Think of it as in-flight entertainment. Cheaper than the headphones, I told him. Not everything. Not Jason's name or Derek's laugh or the exact humiliating math of 31 minutes late, but the shape of it. A boyfriend who chose loud over loyal. A birthday he'd missed entirely. Sawyer listened with his chin in his hand, one eye open now out of what appeared to be genuine effort, and when I finished, he said, with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict, "He sounds like a golden retriever raised by wolves. All bark, no discipline." I laughed, actually laughed, the first real one all night, and something in my chest unclenched half an inch. You're very confident for a stranger critiquing my dating history. I'm very confident in general, he said. It's a personality trait. Ask anyone. They'll say insufferable, but they'll mean confident. What's in Singapore for you? Same thing that's in your folder, probably. He nodded at it, not lifting his head off the seat rest. Ashworth's running a joint executive program with 3 shipping families this summer. My father decided I needed humility training, which is rich, considering he's never once experienced humility personally, and also rich considering the entire program appears to involve manual labor, which I intend to survive by delegating as much of it as management will allow. He extended a hand without opening both eyes. Sawyer Kane, Callahan Kane Maritime. You'll hate me by Thursday. Elliot Hayes, I said, shaking it, and felt the shape of his hand. Warm, calloused in a way that surprised me for someone so committed to doing as little as possible. Ashworth Global Trust. I'll try to hold out until Friday. Optimist, he said, and there was something in the way he said it. Not mocking, just pleased, like he'd found a coin in an old coat that made the 13 remaining hours pass faster than I would ever admit to anyone. Somewhere over the Pacific, he fell asleep for real this time, head tipped toward the window, and I watched the moonlight cut across his jaw and thought, with the specific horror of a boy 11 hours into single life. Oh no. He woke somewhere over the international date line, disoriented, hair doing something architecturally improbable, and blinked at me like he'd forgotten I existed and was pleasantly surprised to be wrong. You stayed, I'm in a middle seat. Where would I go? People leave, he said, easy, unbothered, reaching for the water the flight attendant had left him. That's sort of the theme of your evening, from what you told me. That's cold. I'm establishing a baseline, so that later, when I don't leave, you'll have something to compare it to. He said it lightly, like a joke, but his eyes didn't quite match the joke, and I filed that away too, the way I was starting to file everything about him, carefully, in a folder marked later. You've known me for 9 hours. 10, actually. I've been counting. He caught himself, made a face like he'd confessed to something embarrassing, and busied himself with the in-flight entertainment screen with sudden, unconvincing focus. Somewhere over the Philippine Sea, he fell asleep again, this time with his head resting, entirely without permission, on my shoulder. I did not move it. I have, since that flight, developed a permanent and slightly embarrassing fondness for turbulence, because the one bump of rough air over the South China Sea made him curl closer instead of waking, and I spent the next 40 minutes doing complicated architectural math in my head, purely to avoid thinking about how good it felt to be someone's anchor for once, instead of someone's afterthought. Singapore in July smelled like rain that hadn't decided whether to fall yet. The Ashworth training campus sat on reclaimed land near the port, all glass and steel, and the low industrial hum of cranes stacking containers taller than houses. And on my first morning, a broad-shouldered operations manager named Marcus Tan, 42 Beta, 20 years running Ashworth Southeast Asia Logistics Division, patience worn thin as old rope, handed me a yellow vest and pointed at the yard. Count trucks, he said. I signed a $1 trillion trust document 4 days ago. Congratulations. Count trucks. I counted trucks, in the rain, for 6 hours. Sawyer, it turned out, was doing the exact same humiliating exercise 2 piers over for the maritime side, though I later learned he had spent the first hour attempting to negotiate the task down to supervising the counting, before Marcus's counterpart informed him, flatly, that heirs did not get supervisory titles for a job that required standing in one place. At lunch, he found me under a corrugated awning eating rice from a paper box, with the wounded dignity of a man who had recently discovered his family's fortune bought him exactly 0 exemption from manual labor. "How many trucks?" he asked, dropping down beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched, and immediately stretching out both legs like a man who considered sitting upright a young person's game. 211. You? 209 cargo containers, 1 existential crisis, and 40 minutes of a nap I took behind a stack of pallets that nobody has discovered yet. He stole a piece of chicken off my rice with the casual entitlement of someone who'd apparently decided we were already the kind of friends who shared food. This is my father's idea of teaching me the business from the ground up. I think it's actually just revenge for the yacht incident. There was a yacht incident? There is always a yacht incident with my family. Ask me again when we're better friends, and I trust you not to use it against me at a board meeting. He said this with the weary dignity of a man revisiting an old wound, then, apropos of nothing, sighed at his own rice like it had personally wronged him by requiring a fork. Also, for the record, this training program's brochure promised immersive leadership exposure. It did not mention 6 hours of truck counting. I intend to write a strongly worded, extremely lazy letter of complaint the moment I locate the energy. Are we going to be at board meetings together? He looked at me sideways, rain dripping off the awning behind him, and something in his expression went, briefly, serious in a way that didn't match the rest of him. "I'd like that, actually," he said. "You're the first person here who hasn't either flattered me or resented me on sight." "Give it time," I said. "I contain multitudes." He laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and stole another piece of chicken, and I let him, because some transactions you make on purpose. The weeks blurred into a rhythm. Spreadsheets and shipping manifests by day, rooftop dinners by night, Sawyer explaining freight margins with the same intensity most people reserved for sports commentary, right up until the exact moment the explaining became actual work, at which point he would locate the nearest intern and delegate the follow-through with the smooth, guiltless confidence of a man who considered found someone better suited for this to be a legitimate personal accomplishment. I explained architectural load calculations back at him because it turned out I'd been quietly obsessed with buildings since I was 12, and nobody, including Jason, had ever once asked me about it. "You wanted to be an architect," Sawyer said one night. Both of us cross-legged on the roof of the dormitory building, the port lights strung out below us like a second industrial galaxy. "Before all this, I still want to be. The trust doesn't cancel the dream, it just adds paperwork. What would you build first? If nobody stopped you?" I thought about it, really thought, the way I hadn't let myself in months, because Jason found architecture kind of boring, no offense, and I'd learned to fold that part of myself smaller and smaller to fit in the spaces he left me. "A community center," I said finally, "somewhere with bad Wi-Fi and good light, somewhere a kid who feels invisible at home could go and just exist without anyone needing anything from him." Sawyer was quiet for a second. Then, "I'll invest. You don't even know the numbers." "I know you," he said, simply. Like it was obvious, like 10 weeks was enough data, and my heart did something complicated and undignified that I chose to blame on the humidity. "You're doing the thing," I said. "What thing?" "The then, act like you just commented on the weather. I have no idea what you're talking about." He was smiling, though, the smug one. The one I'd learned meant he knew exactly what he was doing. "Truck counter to truck counter, Elliot Hayes. I think I like you." "Truck counter to truck counter," I said, my pulse loud enough I was fairly sure he could hear it over the cranes. "I think I like you, too." Insufferably confident, occasionally allergic to work and all. He didn't kiss me that night. He was, infuriatingly, more patient than his ego suggested. Instead, he bumped his shoulder against mine and said, "Good, file that, we'll revisit." And I spent the following 6 hours pretending to sleep while replaying the words file, that like the single most romantic sentence in the English language, which, given the source, it somehow was. By late summer, the training program that had started as a 6-week internship quietly became something else. Bennett called it a retention pilot. Sawyer called it my father realizing I'm annoyingly good at this and inventing a reason to keep me here longer than planned. Whatever the paperwork said, the shipping families and the trust extended the arrangement into a full 2-year joint executive fellowship, rotating between Singapore, Boston, and New York, which meant that whatever this was between us, we were about to have a great deal more time to find out. Somewhere around the 10-week mark of training, Bennett granted us a rare Sunday off, and Sawyer declared, with the confident authority of a man who had never once been told no in his life, that we were spending it at the gardens by the bay because he'd heard the trees light up and refused to elaborate further, as if that settled the matter of my entire schedule. It did, in fact, settle the matter. We walked the elevated skywalk between the super trees as the sun went down, the canopy overhead slowly stitching itself into thousands of small blue-white lights, and Sawyer, who spent his working hours discussing tonnage and insurance premiums with the emotional range of a spreadsheet, and his lunch hours discussing nothing at all from a horizontal position behind pallet stacks, went quiet in a way I hadn't seen from him before, watching the lights bloom with something unguarded on his face. "You're staring," I said. "I'm appreciating. There's a difference. At the trees, or—" "Don't," he said, too fast, which told me everything, and I let him have the dignity of pretending the blush was just the light show. We found a bench near the edge of the walkway, city skyline strung out behind the trees like a second constellation, and for a while neither of us said anything at all, which was, by then, its own kind of intimacy. The two of us had spent 10 weeks learning that comfortable silence was rarer and more valuable than clever conversation, and rarer still with someone who actually meant it. "Can I tell you something humiliating?" Sawyer said eventually. "Always." I requested this training program specifically because Bennett mentioned Ashworth was bringing on a new beneficiary my age. I didn't know your name. I didn't know anything about you. I just thought, statistically, it'd be nice to have someone in this whole absurd process who wasn't already 20 years deep into resenting their own family. So I was a coin flip. "You were the best coin flip of my entire life," he said, and reached over, thumb brushing the inside of my wrist where it rested on the bench between us, slow and deliberate, like he was testing whether I'd pull away. I didn't. "I keep almost kissing you. In case that wasn't obvious from the truck counting, and the chicken theft, and the fact that I have, at this point, memorized your coffee order, your least favorite shipping terminology, and the exact face you make when Ortega yells at you in committee. What face do I make? The one you're making right now, like you're deciding whether letting someone in is worth the risk." His hand found mine properly, fingers threading through, warm against the cool evening air. "For the record, from where I'm sitting, it's worth it. I'd bet the whole fleet on it." Which, given how little I actually enjoy running the fleet, is genuinely the highest compliment I have available. That's a terrible business decision. I'm aware. I'm making it anyway. He leaned in, slow enough that I had every opportunity to stop him, which I did not take, and kissed me under a canopy of borrowed starlight, while a super tree overhead pulsed gently blue, like the city itself had decided to keep time for us. "Well," I said, when we finally broke apart, breathless and grinning like an idiot, "that took 10 weeks, I told you." Bad at patient. He kissed my temple this time, softer, almost reverent. Good things, though. Worth being bad at patient for. We stayed on that bench until the light show ended and the crowds thinned, and Marcus texted Sawyer 3 separate times asking if we'd died or something, and neither of us moved an inch faster than we wanted to, because for the first time in either of our lives, nobody was leaving, and there was, it turned out, no reason at all to rush a thing like that. Not every part of falling for Sawyer Kane was smooth sailing, which is a phrase he found unbearably funny, given the family business, and used constantly, and I let him, because some jokes are worth the toll of hearing them 900 times. The closest we came to losing the thread happened at 19 6 months into training, at a Callahan-Kane gala in Boston, that I attended as Sawyer's colleague, a word so thin it practically had holes in it. He spent the evening being steered, hand at his elbow, from one importantly dressed stranger to another, and I spent the evening holding a warm club soda and learning, in real time, what it looked like when a room full of people decided who Sawyer Kane was allowed to marry someday, out loud, in front of him, like he wasn't standing right there. "You'd like the Ferreira girl," his Aunt Priscilla Kane Whitfield, 62, beta, the family's self-appointed authority on suitable matches, a woman who treated other people's love lives like a logistics problem to be optimized, was saying, when I drifted close enough to overhear. "Old shipping money, very sensible, keeps a lovely house. I'm sure she's lovely," Soldier said, in the flat, careful voice of a man doing math on how many more minutes of this he could survive. I should have stayed. I didn't. I found the terrace instead, cold Boston air biting through my jacket, city lights strung out over the harbor, like something Sawyer would have described unbearably as load capacity but pretty, and I stood there long enough to talk myself into being fine about it, which is a skill Jason had accidentally trained into me, and which I resented having to use twice in one lifetime. Sawyer found me 20 minutes later, tie loosened, jacket abandoned somewhere inside, breathing like he'd walked faster than the distance required, a genuine feat of effort, from a man who considered brisk walking to be cardio. You left. You seemed busy being sensibly matched to shipping Harris's. Elliot. He said my name like a correction, like a door closing on an argument before it started. I have spent the last 6 months counting trucks and stealing your rice specifically, because I was not interested in anyone my aunt has ever approved of. That's practically a personality requirement at this point. You didn't say that in there. I didn't say anything in there because I was busy being furious and didn't trust my mouth not to say something career-ending in front of 40 shipping executives. He crossed the terrace, closing the distance with the particular urgency of a man who just realized silence could cost him something real. I should have said it to you instead. I'm sorry. Truck counter to truck counter. I don't want the Ferreira girl. I want the guy who yelled at a golf cake and got on a plane instead of begging someone to love him properly. That guy. Only that guy. The city hummed below us, indifferent and enormous, and I thought about Jason's speakerphone, about Derek's laugh, about how easy it had once been to convince myself that being an afterthought was simply the going rate for being loved at all. I'm not going anywhere, I said finally, but you're going to have to actually say things like that inside, eventually, not just on terraces at 11 p.m. Deal, he said, and meant it. And 6 months later, at the next gala, when his uncle made an offhand comment about suitable matches, Sawyer said, clearly, in front of the entire room, I already found mine, actually. He's the one currently doing the seating chart math in his head, instead of small talk, if anyone's confused. And I nearly dropped my club soda, and it was, without question, the single most romantic sentence anyone had ever said about my spreadsheet habits. Aunt Priscilla, for her part, took the news with the graceful acceptance of someone who had already begun drafting a new, entirely unrelated matchmaking project before Sawyer finished his sentence. 2 years is a long time to fall in love with someone across conference tables, but Sawyer and I managed it methodically, the way we did everything, a little at a time, load-bearing, checked twice before it was trusted. By 20, I'd been placed on Ashworth's North American Logistics Committee, not king, not chairman, just a voting seat among people who'd built careers before I could legally rent a car, and I learned fast that being right meant nothing if you couldn't survive being challenged. A director named Samuel Ortega, 55, beta, 25 years running distribution networks, that never once missed a deadline, tore my first integration proposal apart in front of the full committee. Your timeline's fantasy, Ortega said. You've budgeted 11 months for a refrigerated logistics migration across 4 states. It takes 18. Minimum. Our consultant says 12. Your consultant has never touched refrigerated freight in his life. Ortega leaned back, arms crossed, daring me. You have twice. I closed the deck, privately noting, in the small dry corner of my brain that never fully clocked out even in a hostile room, that I had officially been out-argued by a man whose entire presentation consisted of one raised eyebrow and a personal vendetta against optimism. Somewhere in that same corner of my brain, I also noted that Sawyer, seated directly across the table representing the competing bid, had spent the entire meeting so far doodling what appeared to be a very detailed cartoon shrimp in the margin of his notepad, which struck me as an impressively specific way to demonstrate zero investment in his own family's offer. Across the table, Sawyer, technically my rival that quarter, a fact neither of us found remotely relevant to how we spent our evenings, caught my eye, abandoned the shrimp mid-antenna, and gave the tiniest nod, the one that meant don't fold, don't flinch, listen. Then show me where it breaks, I said to Ortega. The room went quiet. Ortega raised an eyebrow, surprised, maybe even impressed. You're asking me to fix your own deal. I'm asking you to prove the objection instead of just having it. He stood. 7 a.m. tomorrow. Bring coffee. He was right, of course. He tore the schedule apart line by line, and we rebuilt it together, and the rebuild cost us $70 million off the offer, which the seller's CEO did not take well. It was around this time, digging through the supplier network for that same acquisition, that Bennett flagged a name in the file that made my stomach drop a full floor. Cole Athletic, a small regional sportswear supplier that had recently taken outside investment on the strength of rumors that Ashworth was expanding into their category. Bennett didn't ask if I knew the founder. He simply said, "You'll be recused from anything touching this account, effective immediately, on the record," and slid a form across the table for my signature, and I signed it without a single question, because some doors you close before anyone can accuse you of having left them open. "You're cutting $70 million, the CEO said across the final negotiation table, because your own team changed its assumptions. Correct. That's not my problem to eat. It's not being offered to you as a gift," I said. "It's the number. You have other buyers, take the better offer." Privately, I was thinking that this was the third time in a single fiscal quarter I'd had to explain, to a full-grown adult in an expensive chair, that a number was, in fact, just a number, and I was starting to wonder if I should print business cards to that effect. He laughed, the specific laugh of a man used to 22-year-olds folding under pressure. "Kids always think walking away makes them tough. I'm not trying to look tough. I'm trying to buy a company at a price that survives its own supply chain." He glanced toward Bennett, seated at the far end, silent as furniture. "Bennett, talk sense into your boy." Bennett, without looking up from his notes, said, "He's leading the deal. I'm just here for the coffee." The CEO stared at me another long moment, then sat back down. "Sit." We signed 9 hours later. Not at my number, not at his. In the middle, the way every good deal ends, the way, I was starting to suspect, every good relationship did too. Ortega caught me in the hallway afterward, tie loosened, looking, for the first time in our short acquaintance, something close to proud. "You held the line. You gave me the line to hold. I gave you an objection. You're the one who didn't fold when it cost you real money." He studied me a moment longer, the way people study something they're recalculating. "Bennett said you'd wash out by your second quarter. I had money on it, actually. Should I apologize for costing you that bet?" "Costing me that bet is the first thing you've done all year that's made me actually like you, kid." He clapped me once on the shoulder, gruff as a longshoreman, and walked off before either of us had to acknowledge that as sentiment. It was, I would learn over the following years, as close to a compliment as Samuel Ortega gave anyone, and I kept it, quietly, in the same folder in my chest, where I'd started keeping things that mattered. Sawyer was waiting by the elevator when I finally made it downstairs, tie gone entirely, sleeves rolled, looking like a man who'd spent the day losing a deal, and had somehow decided to be thrilled about it anyway. "You beat my family's bid," he said. "I did. I should be furious. You should. I'm not, though. I'm annoyingly, humiliatingly proud of you, and I've been standing in this lobby for 40 minutes because I didn't want to watch you walk out of that meeting without seeing your face first." He said it plainly, no joke cushioning it this time, which was how I'd learned to recognize when Sawyer Kane meant something all the way down. "Come on, I'm buying you a very expensive dinner with money my own family just lost to you, and if that's not romance, Elliot, I genuinely don't know what is." That was the night Sawyer showed up at my hotel room at 11 p.m. with 2 coffees, both cold by the time he arrived, having walked the wrong direction twice because he refused, on principle, to use GPS. He knocked the second coffee clean off the hallway console the moment I opened the door, a full, undignified splatter across the carpet, and stood there staring at the wreckage with the profound betrayal of a man who considered gravity a personal insult. "That was for you," he said mournfully. "I have failed at romance and also possibly damaged hotel property. You're standing in a puddle of your own coffee. I'm aware. I refuse to acknowledge it and would appreciate the same courtesy from you." He stepped inside anyway, coffee footprint and all, and dropped onto the edge of my desk with the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent all day performing competence in a room full of sharks. "I heard you closed Arctic Span. You heard right. You also technically lost that deal to me, since your family was bidding against Ashworth. I'm aware. I'm choosing to be extremely mature about it, and also apparently about the coffee situation, which I am also choosing to never speak of again." "How, exactly, are you being mature about either of those things?" He didn't answer right away. For once, for the first time in 2 years of near misses and file, Thats and shoulders bumped just slightly too long, He didn't say anything clever at all. He just reached over, tucked a strand of hair back from my forehead with a gentleness that didn't match his boardroom voice, and said, quiet, almost shy in a way I'd never once seen from him, "I've been waiting to do this since the airplane. I was trying to be patient. I'm very bad at patient, and apparently also very bad at carrying 2 coffees at once, so tonight has been a real showcase of my limitations. You've been patient for 2 years." I said I was trying. I laughed, and he kissed me before the laugh had even finished leaving my mouth, and it tasted, faintly, of nothing at all, because the coffee was on the carpet where it belonged, and it felt, somehow, exactly like coming home to a building I'd designed myself. Solid, load-bearing, built to last. "I think I'm in love with you," I murmured against his mouth. Somewhere between the truck counting and the coffee crime scene. "Finally," he said, smug as ever, forehead pressed to mine. "I already told the family. My father's thrilled," he said, and I quote, "At least this one has better numbers than the yacht guy." There is still a yacht incident I haven't heard the full version of. "Later," Sawyer said, and kissed me again, and I decided, quite reasonably, that later could wait a very long time, and that someone was going to have to explain the ruined carpet to housekeeping, and that it absolutely was not going to be me. Meeting Sawyer's family properly, not at a gala, not across a negotiating table, but at an actual Sunday dinner in their Beacon Hill townhouse, turned out to be more terrifying than any acquisition I'd ever closed. Eleanor Kane, 58, Alpha, matriarch of Callahan Kane Maritime, a woman who had, according to family legend, once fired a board member over the phone while giving birth, greeted me at the door with a handshake firm enough to qualify as a negotiating tactic, and a look that catalogued my shoes, my watch, and my posture in under 3 seconds. "So you're the trust boy," she said. "Elliot," I offered. "But yes, also that. Sawyer talks about you constantly. It's unbearable. He used to talk about tonnage rates. Now it's you, or your community center, or some story about stolen chicken that he refuses to fully explain." She stepped back to let me in, and there was, underneath the interrogation, the faintest flicker of approval. "I like a man who makes my son shut up about spreadsheets occasionally. God knows he's never shut up about doing less work in general." "That's not fair," Sawyer called from somewhere near the dining room. "I'm extremely productive. I produce excellent naps." "See?" Eleanor said, entirely deadpan, and I laughed before I could stop myself, and something in the room settled, easy, like a held breath finally released. Dinner was, in equal measure, wonderful and excruciating. Sawyer's father recounted the infamous yacht incident in full, humiliating detail. A regatta, a seagull, a ruined blazer, and a lawsuit threat that had somehow ended in the seagull's favor, while Sawyer put his face in his hands and groaned, "I hate everyone at this table," with the specific misery of a man who loved everyone at that table very much. Marcus Tan, who had apparently been invited specifically to corroborate the story, added unhelpfully that there had in fact been a second, smaller yacht incident the following summer, involving the same seagull, which nobody at the table had previously known existed, and which Sawyer immediately, loudly, and unsuccessfully attempted to litigate as fictional. Aunt Priscilla arrived halfway through dessert, took one look at me, and said, with the brisk resignation of a woman closing an old file, "Well, I suppose the Ferreira girl will simply have to remain sensible without him," which made Eleanor laugh so hard she had to set down her wine glass, and made Sawyer mutter, "We are never speaking of this again," which everyone at the table understood to mean it would, in fact, be brought up at every family gathering for the rest of both our lives. Eleanor cross-examined me on Ashworth's governance structure with the thoroughness of a hostile deposition, nodded once when my answers satisfied her, and then, without any warning at all, asked what my mother would have thought of Sawyer. The table went quiet. Sawyer's hand found my knee under the tablecloth, steady, grounding, and offered to change the subject if I needed it. "I think she would have liked that he stole my chicken before he ever asked me on a date," I said finally. "She always said you could tell everything about a person by whether they shared food or hoarded it." Eleanor studied me for a long moment, then raised her wine glass. "Smart woman." "She was," I said, and found, to my own surprise, that I could say it without the old ache swallowing the sentence whole, because there was a hand on my knee reminding me that grief and joy were allowed to sit at the same table, the way they'd been doing quietly, all evening, without either of us minding, and because Sawyer, without missing a beat, chose that exact moment to steal a roll off my plate under the tablecloth, which made me laugh again before the ache had time to fully land, which I suspected, even then, was entirely on purpose. We moved in together that winter, a converted warehouse loft near the Boston waterfront, brick walls, tall windows, close enough to the harbor that Sawyer claimed he could smell diesel and feel at peace, a sentence I found unreasonably charming despite its total lack of romance. I designed the built-in shelving myself, load calculations and all, and assembled roughly 90% of the furniture personally, while Sawyer supervised from the couch with the unbothered confidence of a foreman who had never once picked up a tool and saw no reason to start. He hung the yellow container yard vest, his from the training program, matching mine, on a hook by the door, so we never forget where this actually started, he said, which was, if I recall, you being extremely rude to me about my assigned seat. You were sitting in my seat. I was sitting in my seat. You were early. I was punctual. There's a difference. There it is, he said, delighted, kissing the top of my head as he passed toward the kitchen without offering to help carry a single box. That's the face. Ortega's face, my favorite one. If Elliot and Sawyer have you rooting for them already, follow along so you catch the next update. The reunion is where things get good. 6 years after the golf cake birthday, I flew back to Charleston for my high school's reunion, mostly because my father threatened to attend alone and embarrass me by telling everyone exactly how much Ashworth's beneficial interest had grown, which, knowing him, was a very real threat. Sawyer came with me, in a suit that cost more than the venue's catering budget, holding my hand through the door of the same country club ballroom where, 6 years earlier, I had been an anxious 18-year-old who thought love meant making yourself smaller. He'd spent the flight down debating, at length and with total seriousness, whether it was worth the effort to actually mingle or whether we could simply stand near the dessert table all evening and let people come to us, a strategy he defended on the grounds that cake has gravity, Elliot, it's basic physics, and which, infuriatingly, worked exactly as he predicted. Jason found us within 10 minutes, dessert table gravity having done its job. He looked older in the way people look older when life has been quietly billing them for choices they didn't budget for. Good suit, tired eyes, a wedding ring that was not notably from Derek. Elliot. Hey. He glanced at Sawyer, at our joined hands, and something in his face flickered, recalculating, fast. The way people do when they realize the story they've been telling themselves for years doesn't match the room in front of them. You did well for yourself. I did, I agreed pleasantly. Derek arrived like weather, loud before he was visible, and clocked Sawyer's watch, Sawyer's suit, Sawyer's arm around my waist, with the specific hostility of a man doing very fast, very bad math. So this is the guy, Derek said, not quite a question. Sawyer Kane. Callahan Kane Maritime, Sawyer said, offering a hand Derek did not take. And you're the cupcake guy. I've heard so much. Mostly logistics related, honestly. Very little of it flattering. Derek's jaw tightened. I built a company from nothing. Cole Athletic. You wouldn't understand that kind of work. Cole Athletic filed for restructuring 8 months ago, I said mildly, because I had, in fact, checked, the way you check the weather before deciding whether to bring an umbrella. I heard you took an investment from a supplier who thought Ashworth was backing your expansion. I want to be clear, since I know exactly how this conversation goes in your head. I was recused from anything touching your company the day it showed up in a supplier file, on the record, with a signature and a date, specifically so nobody could ever stand in a ballroom and say what you're about to say. Derek's face changed. You froze that pipeline. Compliance froze it. I signed the recusal before I even knew whether the freeze would help or hurt you, because I wanted no fingerprints on your business at all, good or bad. I let that land. You built promises on my name without asking me, and when the promises didn't hold, that was never my debt to pay. You ran, Derek said, but it came out smaller now, less bark, more bluff. The second Jason picked me, you got on a plane. I got on a plane before you two started dating, I said. You've spent 6 years fighting a competition. I stopped participating in the night you called me little man over speakerphone, and I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to leave a room that didn't want me in it. Derek opened his mouth, found nothing in it worth saying, and in his frustration knocked his own beer clean off the high-top table beside him. A full, foamy cascade down the front of his very expensive shirt, in front of a small and growing audience of former classmates who had, until that exact moment, been pretending very hard not to listen. Nobody laughed, out of politeness, for a full 2 seconds. Then someone near the bar absolutely did, and the sound spread, gentle and unmistakable, and Derek looked around at the small crowd that had gathered, found no allies and one significant beer stain, and did the smartest thing he'd done all night. He left, muttering something about getting a napkin that fooled exactly nobody. Jason stayed, watching him go with an expression somewhere between embarrassment and relief. That was a little funny, he admitted, despite himself, and something in his shoulders loosened, like he'd been waiting 6 years for permission to find any of this messy at all. A little, I agreed. After a beat, he said quietly, I'm sorry. For that night. For a lot of nights. I know. That's it, you know? I accepted the apology, I said. That's not the same as wanting it back. He nodded, wiped under one eye, and managed something that might have been a real smile. He treats you well, Kane? Better than well. Sawyer's hand tightened slightly around mine, warm, steady, the exact opposite of a phone call I'd once had to hang up on alone. He remembers my coffee order, even when he then immediately drops it on the floor. He invested in a community center before he'd even seen the blueprints. He's never once made me feel small to make himself feel tall. He is, admittedly, allergic to assembling furniture, but I've made my peace with it. I'm not allergic, Sawyer said. I'm strategically uninvolved. Jason actually laughed at that, a real one, surprised out of him the way mine had been out of me 2 years earlier on a flight to Singapore, and for just a second he looked genuinely happy for me, in the specific way people can be happy for someone once they've stopped being able to compare themselves to him. Good, he said. You deserve that. I know, I said again, and this time it wasn't about the apology at all. My father, watching from the dessert table with a beer in each hand, caught my eye across the room and lifted one in a small, silent toast. I lifted an imaginary one back. Some conversations don't need volume to be understood. Later, over cake that was, mercifully, not golf-themed, one of my old classmates. A girl named Priya who'd sat behind me in chemistry for 2 years and remembered nothing about me except that I always finished the lab reports early. Asked the question everyone at a reunion eventually asks, the one dressed up as small talk that's really an audit of your entire adult life. So what do you even do now? Last I heard you disappeared to Singapore. I sit on Ashworth's North American Investment Committee, I said. And I design buildings on the side. Community centers mostly. That's such a random combination. It's not actually, Sawyer said, appearing at my elbow with 2 glasses of something sparkling, handing me one without being asked, the way he did most things by then. Not because I couldn't get my own drink, but because anticipating what I needed had become, somewhere along the way, one of his favorite hobbies, second only to finding new and creative ways to avoid chores. He builds things that last. Trusts, buildings, arguments with contractors, it's a theme. I, personally, build absolutely nothing and am deeply at peace with that division of labor. And you? Priya asked, visibly recalibrating her assumptions about the man beside me. Shipping, family business. Also, apparently, husband-elect as of 11 days ago, though I'm told I'm not supposed to lead with that at parties. He said it with such easy, unguarded pride that Priya actually put a hand to her chest. Wait, you two are engaged. 11 days, Sawyer confirmed. I've been counting. It's a personality trait. Priya looked between us, then back at the ballroom, at Jason and Derek somewhere near the bar not quite meeting anyone's eyes, and said, with the blunt honesty reunions seem to specialize in, Wow, good for you, Elliot. Genuinely. You look, I don't know, lighter. I am, I said, and meant it entirely, and felt Sawyer's hand find the small of my back, warm and certain, the exact opposite of an empty chair across a birthday table. Sawyer proposed the way he did everything, thoroughly researched, quietly confident, and completely unable to resist making it funny. He rented out the exact same rooftop in Singapore, where we'd first said truck counter to truck counter, hired the same food truck that used to sell rice to port workers on their lunch break, and got down on one knee holding, instead of a ring box, a small yellow container yard vest with a ring pinned to the collar. I would have gotten you flowers, he said, but you once told me you fell for me over stolen chicken and a truck count, so I felt obligated to stay on brand. Also, I lost the actual ring box somewhere between the hotel and here, so this was partially a logistical decision. Yes, I said, before he'd technically finished the question, laughing too hard to be composed about it. Yes, obviously, yes. I hadn't even asked yet. You were going to. I'm efficient. It's a personality trait. Insufferable, he said, sliding the ring on. But you mean confident, and kissed me on a rooftop that had watched the whole ridiculous, patient, load-bearing shape of us since the very beginning. We married the following spring, on a lawn in Newport, Rhode Island, overlooking water that Sawyer's family had been sailing across for 4 generations, and that I, personally, mostly associated with the number of shipping containers it could theoretically hold. The morning of the wedding, the Atlantic wind kept trying to steal the ceremony programs off the folding chairs, and Marcus Tan spent 20 minutes weighing them down with smooth gray stones he'd apparently sourced from the beach at dawn, muttering the whole time about how some people count trucks, some people count logistics problems at a wedding, it's a personality flaw, I own it, while Sawyer, tasked with the exact same job an hour earlier, had instead fallen asleep in a folding chair in full formal wear, and had to be woken by his own mother with a rolled-up program to the shoulder. Sawyer, when I finally saw him at the end of the aisle, was doing the thing where his composure slipped exactly once, a full-body inhale, jaw working, eyes suspiciously bright, before he caught himself and mouthed, unmistakably, "File that," which made me laugh so hard through the first vow that the officiant had to pause and wait for me to recover, and which is, to this day, my favorite photograph from the entire afternoon. Not the kiss, not the rings, just the two of us mid-law at an altar, already unable to take the moment as seriously as it deserved, exactly the way we'd started. My father walked me down an aisle of white chairs and told me, at the very last second, in a whisper meant to be private and overheard by absolutely nobody except the entire front row, "Better than the cupcake guy. Dad, I'm just saying. Low bar. You cleared it by a mile." Charles Bennett attended in a suit that made the officiant's outfit look casual, gave a toast that somehow included the phrase, "acceptable rate of return on emotional investment," and, when Sawyer's father clapped him on the back and called him a hopeless romantic, replied without missing a beat, "I contain multitudes." Aunt Priscilla, seated near the front, informed anyone within earshot that she had always known, obviously, a claim that Eleanor loudly and cheerfully disputed with photographic evidence from the Boston Gala on her phone, passing it down the row of folding chairs like contraband, while the string quartet valiantly tried to keep everyone's attention on the actual ceremony. Ortega, unexpectedly invited after Sawyer decided the man who'd once made me cry in a conference room deserved a front-row seat to my happiness, spent most of the reception interrogating the caterer about supply chain redundancies for the shrimp cocktail, and pronounced the wedding, overall, an efficiently run operation, which from him was practically a benediction. Marcus Tan brought, as a gift, a small wooden plaque engraved 211 trucks, 0 regrets, which I hung in our first apartment before anything else, including the actual furniture, most of which Sawyer still had not personally assembled a single piece of. There were 11 people at the rehearsal dinner table the night before, no press, no cameras, no headline about the youngest trust beneficiary in the country marrying the heir to a maritime dynasty. Just people who had argued with me, corrected me, counted trucks beside me, and stayed. My phone buzzed once, an unknown number, a short message. "Congratulations. I mean it." I read it, smiled at nothing in particular, and turned the phone face down. "You going to answer?" Sawyer asked. "You sure?" "Very," I said, and reached for his hand instead, the one that still, after everything, felt like the first solid thing I'd ever held onto on purpose. 3 years into marriage, our biggest ongoing conflict is not, as my father predicted, boardroom rivalry or in-law drama, or even the yacht incident, which, for the record, involved a very young Sawyer, a very expensive regatta, and a seagull, and which I am now contractually forbidden from discussing at family dinners, a rule Sawyer invented and enforces with total inconsistency depending on how the story serves him that day. It is, instead, the community center, specifically, one load-bearing wall in it, and my husband's complete refusal to take the wall as seriously as it deserves. "You're supposed to be reviewing the East Wing elevations," Sawyer says, standing in the doorway of my home office at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday, arms crossed, doing his best impression of a disapproving father, which is undermined slightly by the fact that he's wearing my sweater, eating cereal directly from the box, and has, by his own admission, done zero productive work since roughly 4 o'clock that afternoon. "I am reviewing them. You've been staring at that one wall for 40 minutes. It's a load-bearing wall, Sawyer. It deserves respect. You built that community center with your own hands, metaphorically, and now you refuse to sleep because a wall is haunting you, while I, a grown man who owns an actual maritime empire, have accomplished nothing today besides a 2-hour nap and this bowl of cereal, and I regret none of it. Everything I build gets checked twice, I say, which is at this point less an architectural philosophy and more a description of our entire relationship, and he knows it, because he grins around a mouthful of cereal and drops into the chair across from my desk like he has every single night for 3 years. Fine. Show me the wall. I show him the wall. He doesn't understand a single line of the elevation, offers a completely wrong structural opinion with total confidence, and when I correct him says, "I was testing you," which is a lie, and we both know it's a lie, and neither of us cares. Because this, cereal at 11 p.m., a wall that isn't actually haunted, his sock feet propped on my desk, the ring on his hand, catching lamplight when he reaches over to steal my pen. This is the whole point of everything I signed for on an airport folder years ago. Not the trust, not the trucks, not even the buildings exactly. Just this, a table for two, nobody late, nobody laughing at me from another room, a man across from me who chose to stay every single ordinary night, on purpose over and over until staying stopped being a decision and just became who he was. A man who works hard when it matters and does absolutely nothing when it doesn't, and has never once apologized for either. "You're doing the thing," Sawyer says, watching my face. "What thing?" "The thing where you get quiet and sappy and pretend you're thinking about zoning permits." I refuse to confirm or deny. "Truck counter to truck counter," he says, stealing the last bite of cereal. Stealing, also, my heart, which by now he's done so many times it barely counts as theft anymore. "I love you. Now come to bed, the wall will still be standing tomorrow." Everything you say is oddly persuasive for a man who once lost an argument to a seagull. "That seagull had excellent legal representation," he says, entirely serious, and I laugh so hard I nearly knock the desk lamp over, and he catches it. Catches me, really, the way he's been doing since seat 14A. Steady hands, easy grin, the particular quiet certainty of a man who never once, in all these years, made me feel like an afterthought in my own life. It always is. That's rather the point of building things well. There is, I should mention, a coda to the wall story, because Sawyer has never once let a joke die of natural causes. 2 weeks after the 11 p.m. cereal negotiation, he shows up at the community center site unannounced, in jeans I didn't know he owned, holding a single tool, a stud finder held upside down, and announces, with the misplaced confidence of a man who has watched exactly one home renovation video, that he is here to help with the wall situation personally. "You don't know what a stud finder does. I know it finds studs. I am, myself, a stud. I feel we have an intuitive connection. That is not how any of this works. Let me have this," he says, and spends the next 20 minutes wandering the unfinished East Wing, pointing the device at things with theatrical seriousness. A window frame, a fire extinguisher, once, memorably, a very startled contractor named Hugo, before finally admitting defeat, setting the stud finder down on a stack of plywood with the solemnity of a man retiring a sword, and declaring that he will instead contribute moral support and snacks, which turns out to mean sitting on an overturned bucket eating a sandwich and narrating my measurements back to me in an increasingly dramatic voice usually reserved for nature documentaries. "And here," he intones, mouth full, watching me mark a stud line in pencil, we observe the elusive architect in his natural habitat. Notice the furrowed brow, the single-minded devotion to a wall that has never once threatened him. "I will marry someone else. Too late. Already happened. I have the paperwork." He grins around the sandwich, entirely unbothered, and I think, not for the first time, that I fell in love with a man who treats every ordinary afternoon like it's worth turning into a bit, and that somewhere along the way I'd stopped minding, and had in fact started looking forward to it, the way you look forward to weather you've learned to dress for. Hugo, the contractor, later tells me privately that he has never in 20 years of construction work had a client's spouse point a stud finder at him and apologize for it with complete sincerity, and that he considers this, on balance, one of the more memorable job sites of his career. The community center opens the following October, on a lot 2 blocks from the harbor, with bad Wi-Fi exactly as promised and light pouring gold through the East Wing windows I'd argued with a wall about for 3 straight months. My father cuts the ribbon because I insist, and he does it wearing the same expression he wore at the airport 8 years earlier, the quiet, loosened-eye pride of a man watching someone build something that would still be worth wanting, even if the money had never existed. Sawyer stands at the back during the ceremony, arms crossed, not saying a word, which for him is practically a religious experience. Afterward, when the crowd thins and the kids from the after-school program start claiming the reading nook like it's a territorial dispute, he finds me by the front doors and slides an arm around my waist, chin propped on my shoulder, watching the room fill up with exactly the kind of ordinary, unglamorous noise I'd once described to him on a rooftop in Singapore. "You built the thing," he says. "We built the thing. You invested before you'd seen a single blueprint." "I invested in you," he says. The blueprints were just paperwork. He kisses my temple, unhurried, the kind of kiss that doesn't need an audience to mean something. Truck counter to truck counter, Elliot Hayes Kane. Best deal I ever closed. Better than Arctic Span? Arctic Span didn't bring me cereal at midnight, or let me nap through half our engagement planning, or forgive me for the wedding program stones incident, which I maintain was Marcus's job, not mine. He steals my hand instead, laces our fingers together, rings catching the last of the October light. Come on. Marcus is threatening to give a toast, and someone needs to be sober enough to stop him from mentioning the yacht. I let him pull me back into the noise. Kids, coffee, bad Wi-Fi. A father proud of a son who finally stopped shrinking himself to fit in rooms that didn't want him, and think, not for the first time, that 18-year-old me, staring down a golf ball cake nobody would eat, could never have imagined this was the life waiting on the other side of that empty chair. He'd have signed for it twice if he'd known. And that's the story. If Elliot and Sawyer stuck with you the way they stuck with each other, follow the channel. More stories like this one are on the way, and you won't want to miss the next one. Thanks for reading.